Hey guys, I'm Ted, and welcome back to our lecture series. And for our lecture today, we're going to wrap up our discussion on labor and capital. Um, but before we do that, I just like to do our customary recap and just touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture, we looked at the rising tide of labor and capital in the United States. We went back and looked at the Erie Railroad strike, at the Knights of Labor, and we saw the Knights of Labor has an early labor movement, an early labor union that attempted to bridge too wide of a gap. They were accepting skilled workers and unskilled workers, farmers, really just trying to imbue everybody with this sense of communal brotherhood, trying to do really too much and really fail to accomplish in any of their main tasks, such as increased workplace safety, better working conditions, and of course better wages for the union members. We also looked at the Erie Railroad strike, and we saw how the strikers conducted themselves in a manner that attracted the support of the local middle class community, and were pretty much expected. They were projected to be successful in their striking endeavor until the owners of the railroad they threatened to move their operations, and their operations didn't just include the work that the rail employees did. Their operations included the livelihoods, the methods by which the livelihoods were obtained and secured for members of the middle class in that community, and that decisively turned the middle class of that area against the strikers. The thought that the railroad company would move away and everyone would be left destitute, that was enough. That was enough to break the middle class support for the strikers and to sort of doom the strikers to failure and to accept all of the terms that the employer were presenting them with. And it is from there that we pick up in this part of our lecture. Now, the success of the strikers rested on the skill level associated with their jobs. Workers who had to undergo a very lengthy apprenticeship stood a good chance of successfully threatening to strike because they could not be replaced so easily. Now, if clusters of these workers came together, they could affect the change they wanted, and that's what happened. It was clusters of skilled workers that first formed the American Federation of Labor in 1886, otherwise known as the AFL. Now, this union was under the leadership of Samuel Gompers. Now, Gompers was a Jewish immigrant from Great Britain who was a cigar roller by trade. Gompers was a progressive reformer who emphasized the importance of non-violence. Gompers was also very, very bitterly opposed to anarchists and anything having to do with socialism. Very much anti-socialist in all of his actions and all of his moves. Now, Gompers really only focused on attaining better working conditions and wages for the men he represented. He refrained from trying to do any social reforming, and that stood in many that marked him out. He stood in stark contrast to the other contemporary labor leaders of this time, who were developing economic theory to compete with capitalism, because capitalism was affecting so negatively industrial workers. Now, Gompers and the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, they were generally more successful in dealing with employers because of this moderate stance, that Gompers employed. They were the only national labor union that did so during this time frame. Gompers excused all anti-capitalistic rhetoric and agendas. As noted earlier, Gompers was vehemently opposed to the socialist ideas, and he steered his union and members of his union clear of any involvement with socialist plans. Gompers promoted what he called plain and simple trade unionism, Gompers emphasized that his only aim was to seek improvements in working conditions within the capitalist structure. He wanted and Gompers narrowed membership into his union and into the AFL. Membership was narrowed to only include skilled white male workers. And at this time, in the late 1880s, early 1890s, that was an elite group constituting only about 4 to 5% of the entire industrial workforce. So it's a very small group of people with very important skill sets coming together to dictate better terms for themselves, not for all industrial workers, just for themselves, and not looking to change the social structure of the republic at all, just looking for better work conditions and better wages. Now, at this time, Gompers also organized his members by speciality rather than by factory. So he would have all the cigar rollers in one group set, all of the I guess I'm drawing a blank on these high industrial skill sets, but the highly prized skill sets that these workers had, they would be organized by that. They would be organized by their speciality rather than their factory. If at the Carnegie steel plant, you had like a, I don't know, expert steel temperers or something like that, or expert converters or something, rather than being groups that being working at plant XYZ, other Carnegie Steel Company, they would be simply grouped by their trades, by their professions. Gompers. Now Gompers didn't want to change anything, and he really eschewed the socialist approach and socialist plans. But Gompers was willing to use strikes and boycotts, and he was also willing to back political candidates from the existing political parties, but only for his limited aims. And again, his limited aims were higher wages, shorter hours, and more pro-labor legislation. Those were it. He didn't go off on any what they would consider wild tangents, i.e., socialist reforms or any sort of activities like that. Now, Gompers didn't consider those radical in the late 19th century. He didn't consider them too radical. Many considered them radical. Many industrialists would have considered them radical. But Gompers didn't, and he made good use of them. And he attained his limited and largely conservative ends through those means. Gompers also favored mediation and arbitration rather than strikes when dealing with employers. And an employer preferred to negotiate with Gompers than to deal with the radicals. It should be noted that a conversation with Samuel Gompers over labor and how to come to better terms between the industrialist and his labor, it will be a smoother, simpler conversation with Gompers than it would be with Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs would have attempted to put you through the ringer, and gaining better treatment, better services, better quality overall for workers. Okay. Now the larger businessmen could easily make concessions to Gompers, rather than the smaller businessmen who could not really cater to the needs that Gompers wanted. And you really saw a real shift in that AFL members worked for larger firms, larger companies that could readily shift and provide them with these limited aims that Gompers had their leader, had their spokesman, was arguing for. Okay. Now, socialists tended to view Gompers and his activities uneasily. They were opposed to what Gompers and the AFL were doing. And again, the socialists wanted all of the industrial workers, all the laborers, to unite as one. And they thought what Gompers is doing was simply setting them aside, setting the workforce aside, and creating an unnecessary split within this working community, within this workers' community. Now, the socialists held the view that the working class and the employing class had nothing in common. Gompers were betraying the cause of every worker by associating and negotiating with these employers, and everything came to a head. The socialist views and so forth, and their sort of indifference, growing indifference to Gompers and so forth, came to a head in 1905 when they founded the Industrial Workers of the World, also known as the Wobblies. Now, the Wobblies were far more radical. They really were a far more radical union than the AFL. In direct opposition to the AFL, the IWW sought to organize all workers along industrial lines rather than craft lines. Their goal was to recruit enough members to overthrow the capitalist structure. The IWW thought that being a they really thought that being a that being in this union, that calling for this overthrow, that they will be able to attract a lot of members, and they did attract members. They was an organization to be reckoned with, but they never attained the type of prestige that the AFL had. Even now, the AFL is still pretty much recognized by older union men and so forth, and even older industrialists and so forth. People remember that name, the AFL. It meant something long after Sam Gompers died, long after he retired. It means something long after the AFL itself has largely receded from public recognition or understanding. The Wobblies never achieved any of that. They remain very much second class players in this scene, in all of this. They were never has accepted, and really the IWW, the Wobblies, they became the frequent target of government repression, and they suffered because of it. Gompers and the AFL, they've been criticized then and now for their capitulation to industrialists, for their sort of open-handed association with these industrialists. But they were very much like the capitalists they worked for to begin with. You know, they were organized and devoted to achieving the maximum benefits for their members in a capitalistic manner. They operated very much like big business to achieve their goals. This is most evident in the 1914 Clayton Antitrust Act. Now, this act included a clear passage related to labor. And the passage reads, labor was not a commodity article of commerce, and that it had a right to organize and use peaceful strikes, picketing, and boycott, and not be considered a combination and restraint of trade. Very important wording right there. Very, very important a statement in this act. The Clayton Act also placed restrictions on the use of court injunctions against organized labor. And again, in our previous lectures on industrial works, on industrial labor and so forth, we looked at all those strikes. And the one uniting characteristic in those strikes was that, in addition to being able to call upon the state militias, the employer could also go to the courts and get injunctions against the strikers. You know, get them to either vacate the property or to get back to work, to stop holding up trade. So the Clayton Antitrust Act, very important in that regard, and that it sort of swung the pendulum from being all in favor of the employer to giving the workers some benefits and some protections under the law. Now, the AFL will later become the model for the more successful unions in the United States in the 20th century. Unions like the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the CIO. Now, at first, the CIO developed in the AFL. It was the members, the original core members were members of the AFL, but they split off. Um, and they split off mainly due to the AFL's long-standing stance and attitude towards unskilled workers. Remember, the AFL, one of the main reasons the socialists had a problem with the AFL was that Sam Gomper took the creme de la creme, the people with the most bargaining power, the skilled workers who could not be easily replaced. He took them and he had them sort of bargain on. He sort of held them at the main bargaining chip, at the main bargaining tool, that the you can easily replace Johnny come lately, but you can't replace Billy Goodjoe or Billy who's been trained. You had to negotiate with them. You had to capital. You had to find access to their labor on equitable terms. The CIO brought in skilled and unskilled laborers. They put them all in together, and they did this during the Great Depression of the 1930s. The CIO was also willing to use more radical means than the AFL. The CIO would often practice sit-ins inside factories while they were striking. This eliminated the employer's ability to bring strikers, to bring in strike breakers, or to keep the strikers outside outside the factory. It disabled their ability to sort of skirt around the issue and really forced them to confront the workers and try to find a resolution. Because the strikers striking inside the factory brought all production to a halt. Now, the CIO, like the AFL, accepted the capitalist system and strove to work within that system to improve wages and work conditions. Now, employers often hired ethnically diverse workforces to stifle unions, as we discussed in previous lectures. And they also used the tactic of hiring, Anglo-Saxon foremen to work over Irish employees, to put Italians and Jews together to make it more difficult for them to talk and to relate to each other. And they really banked it. They really hoped on using ethnic and linguistic barriers to foster in feelings of separation and isolation among ethnic groups. And when unions did manage to attract these groups, they often had to hold their meetings in several languages. Now, whenever a union member or someone who was unionizing was discovered by sorry about that. Well, whenever they were discovered by employers, the employers would simply fire the person and blacklist that person and the other union organizers. Mass firings were quite common. They made sure that they did work. They made certain that they could not work locally or statewide if they could. They made certain that local avenues for work, local avenues for employment for unionizers was cut short. And of course, you had the phenomenon of strike breakers. Whenever workers went on strike and the employer were able to get them outside the factory, employers brought in strike breakers, and they strategically used different ethnicities as strike breakers. African Americans were often used as strike breakers because they were excluded from the unions at this point. At this point, and they had no problem filling the void left by strikers. Birds of passage were also used as strike breakers, and of course, the birds of passage were transatlantic migratory workers who also had no qualms about coming in as strike breakers. Employers would also had the option of using their private detectives, Pinkerton agents, and so forth. infiltrate labor unions and report back on the activities of these unions. They and of course, employers had the backings of the courts. The courts were all under this laissez-faire haze in which they were very business friendly. They openly and easily backed all the things. They openly and easily backed everything that the employers, that the owners were willing to back, were willing to pursue. Now, unions began to decline in the late 20th century. Had the American economy shifted away from heavy industry, white collar jobs, such as teaching and civil servant industries, rose, but they did not. They did not really shift or supersede or supplant the earlier trade unions, the industrial trade unions. They didn't have the members. They didn't have the numbers to really compare to the previous industrial unions. And because they didn't have the number, they couldn't really wield the type of power. We're looking at large segments of not just cities or states, but really the republic, really the nation, large segments of the nation being engaged in these industrial pursuits. When these workers went on strike, it was a national affair. The Great Railroad Strike brought the nation to a standstill. In the 80s and so forth, in 1981, when air traffic controllers were striking, Reagan fired them because they refused to return to work, and that would have brought the nation really to or at least air travel in many cities to a standstill, to a halt. We will conclude our lesson right there on labor and capital. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys found it insightful, entertaining, and of course, I hope you guys found it interesting. It really is always stated that labor in America is a very peculiar history. It's very curious, the history of labor in America. There's always been this great need for it from the very beginning, with the establishment of Jamestown, and then of course with the arrival of the first 19 Africans again in Jamestown in 1619. All the way through to the arrival of the immigrants, of massive waves of European immigrants in the 1880s, 1890s, 1870s, and whatnot. Always a need for labor, and always competition between labor and capital over conditions. So much more to be said, but unfortunately we have to move on to other topics in our lecture series. But a very enthralling and perplexing situation. And as always, I'm Ted. Please hit like, subscribe, and comment, and I will see you guys next time for another lecture.